Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to see you all. And welcome to the 8th edition of Cinema Rediscovered. I am always really excited to be here. I've been coming for years, and it always means having a long weekend where I get to kind of visit any number of worlds, find out these untold histories, and hear these and see these remarkable stories on the screen. I saw Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust here for the first time. Last year, I saw an Iranian film that I'd never even heard of before, called Brick and Mirror, from the New Wave in 1964. And I felt that you could pretty much roll out the word masterpiece for it. So it's pretty rare that I don't come away from Cinema Rediscovered with a really renewed sense of excitement, I guess, about the gems of the archive, and a sort of celebratory sense of the wealth and the variety of film history. So when I was asked by Maddie and Mark to come and give the keynote this year, I was delighted, and that was particularly the case because of what they suggested I might talk about. They were interested in having me examine the idea of the so-called problematic film, and what it means to kind of write about, screen, or love those films. And of course, it's always a case-by-case basis, right? It depends on your background, what you do or do not wish to see or subject yourself to. It is deeply personal in some ways. And for me, on a personal taste level, I have a perhaps incongruous love for quite macho movies directed by men. Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets, Sam Peckinpah's The Getaway, Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America. And I've written before about what it means to love a movie that doesn't really love you back as a woman, as a feminist, and what a strange contradiction that can sometimes create in a person. For me, the exploratory mission of Cinema Rediscovered is one of the most exciting and worthwhile out there, in that it doesn't shy from exploring those contradictions. That is to say, its programmers have always been interested in all the nooks and crannies of the historical past on film. And that also means finding and celebrating hidden gems, and the women and people of color who were ignored, or whose careers may have been stymied by the power structures of that era. This has been a rallying cry of this festival since its start in 2016. And it's an idea that I have long tried to express in my own work as a film writer and critic. History, film history least of all, does not move in a direct line toward progress. There are peaks and troughs in each era of movies dependent on the national cinema, the political conditions, the industry's health, and the spirit of the generation making them. So, for instance, an American film from 1932 might prove more progressive on women's reproductive rights, which were essentially non-existent at the time, than one from Reagan's 80s. Leanne Brandon, whose pioneering shorts are being celebrated here over the weekend with the Women's Preservation Fund, made second-wave women's lib films in the early 70s. Films like hers might suddenly seem much more applicable to a nation, America, which has overturned Roe versus Wade and made abortion inaccessible to millions. Film history is alive in more ways than one. Aside from the fact that new discoveries of literal film prints are still cropping up from time to time, even the ones we know by heart often prove to have more intelligence and mystery when we learn of an ignored female screenwriter or some other new facet of a vintage story. And while it's true that old white men did, by and large, rule the roost, recency bias might have you believe that everything of the bygone era is plagued by antiquated values and terrible people. And that is not the whole story. Cinema Rediscovered's program this year asks to look beyond that notion, without undermining the realities of the past. It is asking the viewer to look again at what they might see as a familiar narrative of movie history, and to find more there. That means both re-examining movies that we may have seen before or think we know the whole story on, and showing completely rare finds. This year, there are strands spotlighting queer stories from the Eastern Bloc, or highlighting the work of Jeff Barnaby, the fantastical First Nations filmmaker. There's also a celebration of the work of British bombshell Diana Dors, who had a harder edge than the Marilyns or Jane Mansfields she was accused of copycatting, and who starred in genuine social problem dramas like women's prison movie The Weak and the Wicked. As a part of the Out of Their Depth, Corruption, Scandal, and Lies in the New Hollywood strand, there is also a 50th anniversary screening of Roman Polanski's Chinatown, the amazing sunshine neo-noir of Los Angeles corruption and capitalist rot. It is the job of writers, critics, and programmers to provide a safe space for exploration of a film like this, particularly if they choose to screen something which may feel tainted in the eyes of many by an infamously abusive creator. That's what Cinema Rediscovered is doing with its panel discussion this weekend about the Polanski debate and choosing to celebrate his film on its anniversary. But even in the case of films which are simply thorny because of dated material or moments of dialogue that make us flinch in 2024, there's an importance to letting the viewer in on what they may be facing and employing trigger warnings. Some may disagree with the concept, worrying that it over-explains or patronizes the viewer. My feeling is that contextualizing any film with a checkered past or antiquated depictions is pivotal, be that with written descriptions and program copy, notes before the start of a film, or discussion before or after a screening itself. It's hard to face and discuss a problem when you are too busy being floored by it. I'll tell you a story for context, which I think is useful and a little bit embarrassing in terms of why these sorts of warnings are important. In my very early 20s, one of the first ever films that I programmed for an audience was the 1971 counterculture car flick, Vanishing Point. While it's far from the top of the pile in terms of offensive content, I'd also utterly forgotten a scene in which two hitchhikers, effeminate gay men, and totally extraneous to the plot, are humiliated by the macho protagonist. I was embarrassed that I'd failed to mention it in my introduction, and it made me consider something else, too. I'm a straight woman. Maybe some part of my brain was able to reject or repress this utterly unnecessary and nasty moment of homophobia, displayed for laughs, because it had never directly affected me in the way that it might have an LGBTQ+ person. That, too, is part of the reality of considering these topics. It's about unwaveringly looking at yourself and asking where you stand in the viewer-artist matrix of privilege, and being aware of how your own identity and background impact how you feel about a moment like this. It requires sidelining your own feelings and considering others, no matter how much you love the movie. The question of what makes a problematic film also becomes a question of authorship. The cult of the director, that is the auteur theory, is a mercurial thing to judge by. It is a useful organizational method for understanding and consuming film, of course, and part of the larger work of Cinema Rediscovered has been to expand the remit of what we might call an auteur, in other words, traditionally white and male, to filmmakers from Lizzie Borden to Julie Dash. It's a project shared on a larger scale by organizations like the World Cinema Foundation, and one which continues to either explode or explore the canon in ways which let us conceptualize anew what an auteur is and what it means. Equally, though, when it comes to the topic of cancellation or the idea of apportioning blame for a heinous crime committed by a filmmaker, there's the sense that the auteur dominates the picture here, too. Never mind the more innocent creative souls who may have worked on a picture. Should the graft, talent, and remarkable storytelling of artists like the late screenwriter Robert Towne, or stars like Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway go uncelebrated or unremarked on due to the crimes of Roman Polanski? I think mostly we tend to say no, whereas contemporary actors who work with known abusers face a different and more strident judgment. Nonetheless, it's interesting to consider the role auteurism itself has in shaping what art we consider problematic. Actors, for instance, sometimes seem to get more leeway. Take the majestic and undeniably problematic Alain Delon, who is, of course, the star of Le Samurai, which is screening tonight here at Cinema Rediscovered. Maybe it's because they play at being someone else for a living and we end up seeing their identities in a kind of flux on screen. But I digress. A film cannot be considered a literal or direct product of one person's biography. It is the product of unique circumstances, wide-ranging collaboration between tens of dozens of craftsmen, artists, and specialists. Yet, in an ecosystem where film discourse very much includes the personal lives and behavior of its creators, the question of how much responsibility critics have to offer information and context about the people who make the art we're consuming is a nuanced one. How directly should we read biography, affairs, marriages, class background, single mothers, previous felonies, onto an artist's body of work? I would say it pays not to be literal-minded. Filmmakers from aristocratic backgrounds have not only ever made films about aristocrats, for instance. When it comes to those artists accused of a serious crime, or even an unpleasant but minor one, we may not be able to ever completely separate that knowledge from the work itself, regardless of the old truism about separation of the art from the artist. Possibly we shouldn't. But it is also limiting and frustrating to suggest one's personal life is the source from which all art springs. It disallows for the quicksilver unpredictability, an odd detail, and even unwitting serendipity that so often makes movies interesting. The fact remains that to love cinema at all, and certainly classical cinema, it means to sometimes luxuriate in a land of monsters. It can be knowingly, with D.W. Griffiths and Charlie Chaplin's and alleged stories about the behavior of actors like Kirk Douglas. Sometimes, as with Harvey Weinstein, stories flood our timelines and news feeds, and we must reconsider their power, their influence, their impact on the industry, as we've known it. And what we do with it, ultimately, is up to us. Most people tend to pick and choose what we're willing to be party to. To put ticket money in the pockets of so-called living monsters of film is the line in the sand for some. Others simply refuse to watch certain films, or critics will decide against providing any coverage for certain filmmakers. For me, both personally and professionally, I have no real desire to see a new Woody Allen film, for instance, but remain relatively untroubled by watching work starring long-dead stars who I know have been abusers. I don't think that's uncommon. There's the fact that keeping up with all the monsters, living and dead, would be a full-time job. You'd likely need to be a combination of professional researcher, legal expert, and censor, keeping a green and red light list of artists who have committed sins, perhaps with footnotes for the unproven, the convicted, and the moral rather than legal crimes. For me, one of the great aims of cinema is a far cry from that. It is to make us feel less alone, to make us realize the depth and breadth of human experience that can be shared across continents, decades, and identity. Whether the experience depicted is tender or cruel, inclusive or unfathomably small-minded, it is not the job of the artist to be prescriptive, or to provide moral instruction or a design for living. That's not unblemished by the reality of abusive behavior, but it is also linked to the idea that film has a life of its own once it's reached its audiences. As culture critic and author Claire Dederer points out in her brilliant book, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, it's a particularly odd position when you're a woman who has been at the mercy of some of this toxicity, but also in the position of someone who simply loves what they love. She says, quote, "I'm not just sympathizing with their victims. I've been in the same shoes or similar. I have the memory of those monstrous things being done to me. I don't come to these questions with a coldness or a dispassionate point of view. I come as a sympathizer to the accusers. I am the accusers. And yet, I still want to consume the art. Because out in front of all of that, I'm a human, and I don't want to miss out on anything. Why should I? Why should I be deprived of Chinatown or Sleeper? This tension, Between what I've been through as a woman and the fact that I want to experience the freedom and beauty and grandeur and strangeness of great art, this is at the heart of the matter. It's not a philosophical query, it's an emotional one. Equally, from a curator or writer's perspective, we are, from where we stand now, more aware than ever of the people whose lives and careers have been damaged or shortened by the conditions of filmmaking of the past. Stories of systemic abuse, inbuilt racism, and the historical punishment and exclusion of marginalized people. And so we must hold this balance, even sometimes the contradiction, in our heads. Part of the project of restoring and showing classic cinema is to bring the less progressive impulses or figures into the light, too. To do otherwise is not to present a full picture of the past. The aim of cinema can be commercial or polemical. A film can expand our worldview, and it can also sadly show us how pitifully flat the worldview of its creator is. This is, no matter how uncomfortable, if given the appropriate context and trigger warnings by its curators, within the remit of film historians, critics, and curators to discuss. For me, like Clara Detterer, it never feels totally reconcilable. My enthusiasm for a film where Steve McQueen slaps his wife around in The Getaway, or one where Robert De Niro says, "You call those skanks girls?" in Mean Streets, is bound to raise an eyebrow or two. Even if depiction may not be endorsement, it's still a curious thing. I guess I would say that I'm interested in how women survive in film, and concurrently the world, in spaces not meant for them. How they often make it work by grappling their way through a patriarchal environment, or flouting what might be seen as conventional feminist behavior in their efforts to move forward. And so the films in which women get the hardest time from men, or their interactions with men are colored by difficulty, often have a special appeal to me for their ability to look at the darkness of gendered power relations with such clarity. But that's me. That's my taste. It may not be yours. But if we're talking about the role of film criticism and curation, we are talking about the ability to enter these dark corners and ambiguities, because that's what good films do, too. James Baldwin wrote that the artist's role is to, quote, make you realize the doom and glory of knowing who you are and what you are. There's a reason he puts those two words together. For me, great art is born of paradox, of holding two opposing ideas in the minds, of the doom and the glory of being human. There's doom and glory in Chinatown, and there is in the realization that we can be both victims and victimizers, guilty of terrible crimes and capable of beautiful and life-changing creation. There is no excuse or rationale for the fact Roman Polanski has escaped punishment for his crimes. There is also no denying that his work is prodigious, and markedly, prodigiously haunted. The most dazzling works of art can also reveal pitiful human limitations, particularly cultural and social ones like homophobia, racism, and sexism. But seeing and parsing mankind's limitations up on the screen is maybe, arguably, sort of the point. To realize the doom and glory of knowing who you are and what you are is to face the ugliness of history alongside its moments of sublimity, not to raise oneself up on a pedestal and assume our forebears knew nothing, and therefore that our film history could only rear the problematic. It does a disservice to the memories of filmmakers and luminaries from Ida Lupino to Ossie Davis to not recognize the sensational work they made under circumstances stacked against them, rather than subsume them to a simple story about the bad old times. Looking at the remarkable career of film producer and festival programmer Linda Miles, who was here as a guest of Cinema Rediscovered this weekend, should also prove instructive about the ways in which curation, even of films from the past, can be revolutionary on its own terms. To really engage with cinema of the past is to hold both the hopeful and the troubling up to the light. This is never about dismissing the upsetting and even illegal things done by powerful figures in film, to simply excuse bad behavior under the guise of male genius or craziness and give the patriarchal powers that be a free pass. But it is about reckoning with the complexity of what those moments on screen and figures behind the camera tell us about the world, ourselves, and our pasts. As Clara Detterer has it, there has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. There is doom and glory in all of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Really thought-provoking talk, and very timely, and relates to obviously a number of areas that we're exploring in Cinema Rediscovered, and sets it up really well. In terms of the complexity, is the sort of key thing for me. But within that, and I think one of the things that Claire Dedderer talks about, or there's a great sentence, and we've used it for the event on Friday, which is the coming together of two biographies. That it's the audience's biography, and it's the biography of whoever is around that, and these two things meet. And therein is, and the subtitle to the book is A Fan's Dilemma. Mm-hmm. It's particularly that. It's kind of one area that I think is interesting as from the audience perspective is when you come to it. But there are kind of two areas I was thinking about. One is dealing with. I don't kind of want to go on about Chinatown, but it's just the sort of. I'm going to. It's the sort of obvious example, because here was a film that I put together as part of the season. And I had to, sort of think through what that meant. But the other one is the changing nature of the audience in relationship to work, and in relationship to, the kind of what's happened around it. And I guess Harvey Weinstein is the sort of big figure in that. And I remember when I was teaching with the University of West of England, we ran a film course, and it was when the Harvey Weinstein revelations came out and the whole Me Too thing was happening. And one of the students, postgraduate students, said to me, "So you're not going to screen Harvey Weinstein films anymore?" Which was like, and there was a sense, maybe is that what we do? Is that what we do? We're not going to sort of screen Harvey Weinstein films. And then there was it's just a couple of experiences. We were screening Pierre Le Fou here in the cinema, which I would just take as a stone cold classic. Mm-hmm. But there was a response from a younger audience that was an intake of breath to the yellowface scene within Pierre Le Fou. And you went, audiences are changing, and just wondered what you thought about those two examples and those areas, and how you sort of, I guess, navigate that as well as a critic.
I can only speak from my own experience of that, but I feel like I kind of caught the tail end, being a millennial, of going to film studies classes and going to film school and learning about the canon in a way which was, the very traditional way, which was learning about your Bergmans and your Godards, and it was a very kind of top-down hierarchical view of film culture, and very white male dominated, and maybe that accounts for some of my tastes too, or the things that you love when you're sort of in your formative years of film school, or in your formative years of becoming a cinephile. But it's interesting to watch the sea change in terms of the sight and sound poll changing, for instance, certain films falling down in the poll that had been there, stuck there for years, and a lot of that has to do with Me Too, and a lot of it has to do with audiences who are looking at things in, I think with slightly more critical eyes. My sister is Gen Z. She's 12 years younger than me. She's just turned 21. And watching films with her and some of her friends has proven as instructive, if not more so, than many film classes I could take, because it is stuff that sometimes I think that they're being reactive, or I think, okay, well, maybe you guys don't know the whole context of this thing, and I feel like I need to contextualize it for them in some way. But other times, there are things that I think, well, I didn't think about that actually, And so it is just a constant conversation.
Yeah.
The problem, I think, is, well, the problem that tends to crop up, particularly on social media, is that both, I don't want to say sides, because I think it's far too much of a gray area to say sides, but, kind of both elements, or these, people disagreeing with each other, it tends to become emotional and extreme quite quickly. And I guess that's where the trouble comes in.
And and I do want to please, I'm sure you've got questions and prepare questions, but I'll come to the audience in a second. But the other point I was thinking is, again, with that experience of putting the Out the Depth season together, and being aware, 50th anniversary of Chinatown, and there was a part of me knowing what happens in social media, knowing that you feel that there's a crowd out there that are just kind of moving around through this sea of social media, waiting for the next bit of raw meat. And was I prepared to be that raw meat? I think was the question, which is a self-censoring question of am I prepared to go there? Because you feel that you might have to take on whatever, I don't know what but you can sense what it might be. And I guess the ultimate full stop is, oh, Mark's cancelled. That sort of very modern day phenomenon. And I wonder if that was something that, as a critic, but I know you do a programme as well, so with both hats on, but is that also something that begins to kind of come into the consciousness when you're putting either a piece of writing, thinking about a subject matter, or is I'm not going to go there because of whatever?
I think that my feeling is the only way that you can tackle things like this, which are thorny and sensitive, is to make them personal up to a point. Whether that's curating something or writing about something is a little bit easier because you have a little bit more leeway to kind of explain your thinking, or if you want to talk about something which feels, I don't know, controversial, for lack of a better way of putting it. But I do also think, I guess there is a self-censoring element in as much as you can create a straw man in your head that people are going to be bothered by this thing. I think ultimately the only way you can break through that is to feel your way through it, and also make yourself vulnerable and make yourself willing to listen to other people's perspectives. Because I know there are plenty of people that were initially at the thought of trigger warnings sort of like, oh, well, that seems why are we going to have to explain things in advance for an audience? Now that is par for the course, right? And it's sort of why I mentioned it when I was talking about it, is I know that not everybody necessarily is on the same page about it, but generally speaking, it has been a force for good, I think. And I think being aware of the sensitivities of the viewer and having those discussions is the most important part of curating anything. I think you can curate a lot of things which people might raise an eyebrow at, as long as you're thoughtful and honest.
Does anybody want to come in with any questions? We have roving mic. Yeah, there's a question right in the middle. If we can get a mic. Where's Steph? I'll do the roving mic. Oh, Louise, are you going to do it? Okay. With the cap on there. So that everybody can hear, and also the online audience.
So obviously you talked about, I guess in a way, separating the artist from the art, say as Polanski. But is there certain elements where you can't do that, say Lars von Trier, where, say if you look at something like Antichrist, where there's, self-mutilation of the genitalia, obviously, what happened to Willem Dafoe, where she crushes, obviously, certain areas and whatnot. And then you look at the accusations of Lars von Trier, where I think Bjork accused him of sexual harassment. And to that, would you say there's a certain point where we can accept what's in cinema? Because when we look at the film and the person, especially Lars von Trier, I think the two collide very much of what he's showing, what he is as a person.
I think part of the reason that we kind of generally tend to find Chinatown an easy one not an easy one to talk about, but an easier thing to talk about, is because it doesn't feel particularly close to Roman Polanski as a person. I mean, people have argued that Polanski's worldview is naturally, given his, various things that happened in his life, very dark, but it is something that you can hold separately. Whereas a Woody Allen or perhaps a Lars von Trier, there is something deeply personal. They do kind of bleed all over their work. I think it's impossible to not read biography onto film in some ways. And I think we all, certainly as a critic, when you're talking about film history, you think about where a certain filmmaker was at a certain part of their life, or whether they just had a terrible breakup, or, these things have to kind of, it's quite porous, I think. Which is ultimately, I think, why the phrase itself is probably an issue. You're forcing something which is not maybe a natural thing.
Is anybody else? The separation. Oh, there's a question over there. Yep. If you just hang on a second till that microphone gets round. Thanks, Louise. That'll increase your steps.
You talked a little about the erasure of women and people of colour from early films. Are there any particularly important people who you'd like to see remembered in future?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned some as well in my talks. Ossie Davis, I think, is amazing. Ruby Dee as well, his wife. I mean, these are people that, a lot of cinephiles appreciate, but that, I think wider retrospectives of their work would be exciting. I think certainly filmmakers like from early Hollywood, which Pamela Hutchinson is definitely sorry, I didn't mean to point at you, Pam, a specialist in. People like Dorothy Arzner, the BFI actually just did a season on. So I think things are trending in a good direction in that way. And I think the act of rediscovery and the act of kind of, platforming certain filmmakers of the past that didn't necessarily get their dues at the time is something that people are more and more interested in.
Anybody else? Question? Yeah, Andy, right, the back there. Sorry, Louise, you've got to go. We usually have two. We usually have one person either side. They're obviously at the 6 o'clock gym.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts in relation to something that I've sort of come across when talking to audiences, fairly recently, and that is a willingness to be outraged by what's on screen without thinking about the context in which that image or words or whatever it might be appears within the film. So often, people say, I can't believe you showed a film that had that in it, or that character in it. And you say, but that character was a despicable character. You're not meant to be agreeing with them or liking them or anything, but you're outraged without kind of trying to engage with the film, just by the image or the words.
I mean, again, it's so difficult because it's such a specific thing to the viewer and the film itself and what we're talking about. But I think there is maybe sometimes with younger audiences, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think there can be a tendency to just not want to be in the headspace of such, an unpleasant character or something which is, these deeply unpleasant situations. And I think maybe you can see that reflected in something like, Raging Bull falling quite far down on the Sight and Sound poll. Nobody's, going to have to worry about that film's reputation, to be clear. Like, no need to rescue that film or its filmmaker in any way. It's fine. But there is something interesting about this idea of, is a film depicting really toxic masculinity and really kind of quite brutal domestic violence. And people all know that Martin Scorsese, I like to think, most people know Martin Scorsese isn't patting Jake LaMotta on the back. That's not the point of the film. But ultimately, maybe people don't want to be in that headspace, or they've had enough of toxic masculinity. They've had enough of these kind of studies of toxic masculinity, and it's something that they'd rather spend time, if they're going to go to the cinema, in a different viewpoint, whether that's right or wrong.
I think that's an interesting point in relation to running a cinema, running a venue. Going back to my Pierre LeFou experiences, that was part of a rep programming, and you can put the film on. I mean, from my side, a bit like you were saying about Vanishing Point. It's like, well, that's a classic, what is the problem here? From just before programming it and, so put it on. And, I have a relationship with that film that goes back many years and, be happy to talk about it, but I'm not there at the screening in a way that, Andy's saying perhaps is that the context, that the audience is coming in, and again, it's their biographies that are coming to the film. And I guess it's a question for programmers in cinemas, is that you might have that awareness, but you're not actually there when it's presented, which makes the act of sort of putting films on quite a interesting, I'm going to say tightrope walking in sometimes the experience, because you've rationalised it in your head or intellectualised it or whatever. Is that something that, again with, well, I guess you talked about it with that experience of putting it on?
I think there's always a risk of, if you care greatly about cinema, if you're really passionate about it, and certainly if you're in a position where you're able to then curate things for people or tell people to be, point them in a particular direction as a critic, that you can miss certain things that people may, issues that people may raise, and that I think people can become a little bit blinded by their own excitement about a film or their own certainty, like, this is a classic, this belongs to the canon. Like, I love Raging Bull, that's, but going back to that, like, if I were to watch that with a audience anew, and someone were to come out and say to me, well, I like the film, but it was what, or maybe they didn't, but they come out and they say something about the fact that they didn't want to be in that space. Like, I have to respect that, and I think sometimes maybe that can be an issue.
I wonder, I was just thinking, it was something that somebody earlier on said, the art world has a kind of relationship with, it's got a longer history, but it's got a relationship with controversial art, and galleries and museums have that sort of, ongoing dialogue with that history, whereas cinema is kind of seen as a ephemeral thing that just comes and goes, but maybe we should be actually taking it more, it should be given more weight, more seriousness in terms of this is an art form that deserves that kind of curatorial and critical sort of dialogue, rather than it being seen as quick review, the sort of one-line reviews and the very kind of short, it's a 5-star, a 7.5 star, or that Brancusi's a 2-star, or that it's that side of it. Yeah,
I think fundamentally there's a sense that maybe there is still a little bit of disrespect for cinema as still one of the younger art forms, and therefore the kind of discussions around how it's presented. And maybe I could argue for the fact that there should be somebody to intro films all the time. Somebody should always be able to come in and give context for a film.
Well,
more jobs for people in film.
as my colleague Steph knows, that's what I said. If we could introduce every screening here, it was something that I thought that's actually, because we are, and people will have heard me saying this before, but cinema is not all the same. And the commercial mainstream does its job and it does it very well, but we're in a point of difference. We're very different, and actually that difference would be brilliantly manifest with every screening's introduced, because this is an important thing. Now, of course, you then get the kickback quite quickly with why have you got to introduce everything? But I agree that principle that you're giving it the kind of weight, as it were, of the personal investment.
Well, it's certainly one of the most visceral of art forms. People are, deeply moved and shaken. Coming to the experience of going to the cinema is, captivating to the senses in a way that perhaps other art forms are less so, arguably. And, we've all been to films before, old or new, and had a companion or someone else in the screen that was, either very upset by a film or really frightened by a horror movie or something. People do have very strong reactions, and I think there is something to the idea that just like there are trigger warnings, it'd be interesting to have like a, when the context calls for it, a space for people to have discussions about, their reactions to these things.
There's a question here. Time for a couple of questions and then...
Hi, thank you so much. It's so nice to have permission to show things that are dodgy. But I wanted to come back on the point that you were making, Mark, because I know from other conversations that I've had with you, just the impact, particularly for younger audiences who may be familiar with some of these films but haven't seen them on a big screen. And can you say something a bit more about the fact that they're being seen on a big screen with an audience and the impact that has on the viewership? And I was going to say something about, do you think you need to introduce every film, but you just answered that.
So is that for you, Mark?
It's for both of you.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was for you. But I am actually thinking of an example and thinking whether I should say it, but I suppose I've got to now. Because the flip side to introducing every screening. So every screen, that point of difference and distinction is, decisions are made, curatorial decisions are made. What goes on screen. With independent cinemas, there's invariably somebody that's doing it. With the commercial mainstream, that person might be in America or whatever, and the rationale is a very different rationale to what an independent cinema is doing. Equally, what you want to say is, well, audiences are grown up, and they can read stuff and they can find out. And look, we've got this information, we've got this. We used to do parent and baby screenings, all certificates. So it's not for the baby, it's for the parent. The baby's not interested in watching the film, and I was very adamant that I'm not. People can make up their own minds and their own. They're grown ups, for goodness sake. However, I suddenly remembered that, because we would show the parent and baby screening would be the film that would be just opening, and I realised on the Monday morning when we were due to screen it that the film was 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days. Yeah. Exactly. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's a bit. So I went into but I was here. I went in and I said to there weren't many people, but I said, do people know what? I don't usually do this because but do people know what this film's about? And there was one woman that said, no, I've just come to see it, and it was a real point there of but anyway, I did that. But that's a kind of example, I guess, of where a piece of work is really powerful, and it's a really powerful piece of art, and it's going to, about that area, So how, and it's at that moment I'd thought, oh, this is one can or whatever. This is the greatest film. We're going to put it on. It's going to be on for 2 weeks. Hopefully, it'll play for 10 weeks, and it'll be a huge big hit. Yeah, but what about somebody that's a woman who's had to deal with and then sitting in that audience? What So yeah, that was my. Still gives me shivers.
Well, I mean, it's also, it goes back to that idea of, you can come up with a bunch of very objective, very sort of quite hierarchical reasons on paper to screen something. I'm not saying that means you shouldn't screen it, but that there are reasons not to. But ultimately, I think there does need to be this embracing of sensitivity and also an embracing of being willing to have quite uncomfortable conversations, because I think people are often just too nervous.
Well, and it's care for the object, the art object, the film, and it's care for the audience. But it's not saying, I guess it's not, I'm going to duck that because it's difficult. But actually embrace the difficulty, you're saying, and that kind of challenge and the complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also, I think there is maybe an argument to be made, and I think has been made, about certain viewers. You kind of touched on when you said grown-ups, they can make their own choices. That on the flip side, that some viewers do seem to want to be coddled by cinemas and by films themselves. And of course, as a critic, you want people to love the same fatalistic 70s films with ambiguous endings that you love, and you don't want people to need answers.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Not every viewer is wired that way. I guess as a commercial or a commercial cinema or cinema that runs, needing to earn money, then those are other elements that come into it.
Great. Well, there's a couple of questions. I knew. Oh, there's 4 questions. Right, how am I going to do that? Nev here, who had hand up first.
Hi. I'm just wondering, great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
To what extent we talked about trigger warnings, mentioned trigger warnings, which I'm a big supporter of actually, but to what extent do you think it's the responsibility of critics or curators or indeed friends to tell people about the behaviour of filmmakers and to put context for those who badly behaved before they watch the work?
I guess it depends on whether we're talking about a contemporary film or a film from the past. Because if we're talking about long dead abusers or things of that nature, I'm not sure that it's something that you would need to lead with. Whereas if you're talking about actively spending your money to go and see something by someone who stands to make a profit from your cinema ticket, that's a different matter, and it probably is worth flagging in a review. And though I know some critics who just won't review new movies by Polanski and new movies by Woody Allen. Also just depends on your word count, to be totally frank, sometimes. But, yeah.
Maddie, what's your view on questions?
I think two quick ones.
Two quick questions. Well, if you're down there, I'm sorry, person at the back, but there was two hands up down here, so Pamela.
I'll be really quick. I just want to say that was absolutely fantastic. It's given me lots to think about. I loved your phrase about luxuriating in a land of monsters. I really wanted to pick up on that, and I just think that that's such a useful way to think about this as a large landscape that has the monsters within it, and also, I don't know what we're going to call them, but the Dorothy Osmonds and Julie Dashes, the sort of angels of this landscape. And I just wanted to thank you and maybe prompt you to talk a little bit about this sort of big landscape that has more than just the monsters in it, and what you take from the breadth and variety and complexity of this kind of landscape of film history. But just thank you so much.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. Gosh, I don't know where to start with that. I guess for me, I said a little bit before, while I was speaking about this idea of enjoying films in almost a perverse way in which women struggle a lot, and in which women are often sidelined by quite masculine worlds, and I feel as though in our rush, not wrongly, in our rush to kind of right the ills of the past, it's very easy to, I guess, bypass films in which, say, the female characters are not perfect paragons of feminism, or who may be kind of trampled on victims. And there is a school of thought which would say that they're just sort of stereotypes, or they're just, nothings, doormats. And actually, I think there's a reflection of some kind of lived reality in the idea that, we didn't go from trampled on housewife to, feminist paragon in one fell swoop, that there is a lot of middle ground there. What about the women that got left behind by the second wave women's lib movement? Because not all women were women's livers in the 70s, right? And what do these films have to tell us about the way men looked at that generation of that sea change? I don't know why I keep thinking about the 70s, but it's clearly on the brain.
Very helpful.
But yeah, so I think they have a lot to tell us about the world that we live in and the world that, the recent past.
One last question, Anna.
Thank you. First of all, just beautiful presentation, beautiful text, as always. So much to think about, but I wanted to pick up on something that your text made me think about. And you write very prolifically and very beautifully about films, both new and old. And you were talking a little bit about wrestling about your own love for films that don't love you back, especially for your own personal taste, but that can be applied almost to any individual, any cinephile. Do you sense, both as a critic and as a cinephile, almost a desire to punish films by either excluding them from narratives, from pieces, from reviews, or from curation, almost in a way to correct the wrongs of the filmmakers or actors or anyone else involved in the film? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
I guess it's possible that there is a sense of that. I mean, I don't work within kind of a programming context enough to have, it real kind of internal insight, I guess. But I do feel, I mean, I guess I sometimes feel a bit embarrassed to be a person that's like, oh, there's like, I'm excited about a Sam Peckinpah season, because it feels a bit like, Yeah, okay, fine. Sam Peckinpah, we all know his deal. We all know the stuff that he said about women in the 70s. We all know how he treats sexual violence on the screen. And yet, I want to see those films big. I still think they have an enormous value and beauty, and they can definitely create a lot of conversation and a lot of discourse, and probably quite virulent conversations, I would say, afterwards. So yeah, maybe so. Yeah, I'm not sure if I know the answer exactly, but I do know that I want to continue to see films made by people like that, as well as I want to see, you know, films made by not old white men.
Okay, draw it to a close there, but because Christina's got to introduce Gilda. It's at 6:30. But thank you very much, Christina Newland.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And yes, as I say, Gilda is on at 6:30, and it's almost 6 o'clock. What?